It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Amelia Ryan. She's worked in habitat restoration and resource management for over 20 years. She's currently the vegetation ecologist at the Pinnacles National Park. She previously worked at Point Reyes National Seashore on several restoration and endangered plant projects for nearly 14 years. And she started out at Armstrong Redwoods in the late 90s. She developed a love for plants growing up on 40 acres in western Sonoma County. She's a botany major from UC Davis and has a master's in ecology from San Francisco State. She's also a longtime member of CNPS and served on our Marin Chapter Board for 6 years. So it's a real pleasure to have Amelia back with us to talk about Pinnacles Jewelflower. It's an undescribed species, and there are other rarities at the Pinnacles that she's also going to talk about. So Amelia, let me turn it over to you.
Hi. Sorry. So I'm here with Christine, and I was just unmuting my computer. So, all right. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about the Pinnacles Jewelflower, a species that I've been working on for a while, building on the work of many other people, actually. And then I'll talk a little bit about a few other rare plants at Pinnacles. So this is a excuse me. So I thought I'd start first, though, by talking a little bit about Pinnacles, because everyone may not have been there. And let's see. And here is let's see if we can try it. Maybe there's this way. Oh, okay. So first I want to acknowledge that I am talking about work I'm working on with my co-author and researcher, Dr. Eva Lucacho, who's from the UNAM Polytechnic University in Mexico. And you guys are up here. Actually, it should be pointed a little bit higher, that upper area, Marin. And Pinnacles is down there at the bottom of the screen. It is roughly parallel to the Monterey Peninsula, the inland from it on the other side of the Salinas Valley in the inner coast ranges in the Gavilan Mountain Range. And Pinnacles is known for its rock formation, which you can see here. And that's what it was named after. It's got some fantastic rocks and some kind of really cool old, slightly heart-stopping trails. It's also known for being one of the sites of the reintroduction of the California condor. And it's known for its beautiful spring wildflower displays. And this, in fact, is one of our rare and beautiful spring wildflowers, Clarkia brewerii, also known as fairy fans, which has a delicious sort of cinnamony scent, as well as a beautiful flower. So Pinnacles is dominated by chaparral. It covers about 82% of the park. It's particularly dominated by chamise. Our second most common habitat is oak woodland and savanna. Here you can see blue oak woodland, which covers a lot of the park as well. And then we have riparian and stream habitat. A lot of the trails actually follow these sort of beautiful protected, more protected areas along the drainages in the park, which are much more lush. And then, of course, we have a lot of rock and scree, particularly in the upper areas of the park. And the species that I'm going to talk to you about today is one of the species that's sort of found in this more rocky habitat. So this story kind of starts with an herbarium. And this is a picture of the Pinnacles herbarium, also our museum, same building. Or to bring it back even further, you could say it starts with a volunteer. who in 1982 was exploring the park, and she found a strange little kind of mustardy looking plant growing in the park. And she collected a specimen and pressed it, but it was too young and they couldn't tell what it was. It had no fruit on it. And so she went back, and this is probably what it looked like. Here's a picture of it, of young plants. This is probably something like what she saw. And so she went back in later that same year, and she collected some more plants, these ones with fruit, and they were identified as Colanthus lemony, a type of jewel flower in the mustard family. And a key characteristic of this plant is this little sterile cluster of flowers at the top, sort of a little top knot, that many species of Colanthus as well as Streptanthus have, and is kind of a distinguishing feature. And there indeed is Colanthus lemony, which is found all throughout the region. You can see there's this little sterile cluster at the top. And that's sort of an adaptation for attracting insects by having a bunch of kind of brightly colored, the bright color spot at the top to catch their eye. And that was a good guess. In 1986, just a few years later, Pacific Grove Museum botanist and curator Vern Eden collected a mature specimen of Colanthus lemony on the Shalone Creek drainage, which is the same drainage that runs through the park, which is a little downstream. And Vern Eden was is a very renowned botanist, and so this is definitely a good ID. So about 20 years after collecting the herbarium specimen, however, the Pinnacles botanist at that time was a fellow named Tom Leatherman, and he was going through a bunch of herbarium records and setting aside ones that seemed suspicious. He wanted to kind of clean up and improve the herbarium, and he set this Colanthus specimen aside as kind of a suspicious. He was not certain that it was correctly ID'd. He thought it actually looked more like another species that's closely related, in a closely related genera, not a Colanthus, but a Streptanthus. And nearby in 2 Pinnacles, elsewhere in the same county, San Benito County, is another jewel flower called Streptanthus insignis, San Benito jewel flower, and it also has a sterile cluster at the top. But it's of course of a different genus. So he thought it might be that. Now, a thing to understand is that we have these 2 different species named Streptanthus and Colanthus. Well, these are part of a group of plants called the Streptanthoid complex, kind of commonly known as jewel flowers, that include several genera. But it's important to note that this is a paraphyletic complex. So if you look here, you can see that Colanthus, which are the Colanthus clade, things with the C on them, are actually interspersed amongst things with the S at the beginning. The S stands for Streptanthus, and the C starts for Colanthus. This is genetic work that was done in 2014 by my research partner and several other folks, looking at the genetics of the Streptanthus Colanthus clade. They also have Thelopodium and Stanleya in there. So it turns out that Streptanthus is all over the place, mixed in with some Colanthus and with some Stanleya. And the Colanthus is also kind of scattered around. But there is this sort of distinct Colanthus clade in purple in the middle. And then there's also this Streptanthus glandulosus complex, and both of those are 2 monophyletic kind of branches. And the sterile terminal clusters evolved twice, once in the Streptanthus glandulosus complex and once in the Colanthus clade. And to give you an idea of what some of that diversity of types are of the streptanthoid complex, here is a picture of a bunch of different jewel flowers, both Caulanthus and Streptanthus. So back to our story. In 2000, Pinnacles botanist Tom Leatherman hired 2 professional botanical contractors, Roy Buck and Glenn Clifton, to review the herbarium. They also happened to be Streptanthus experts. So they came and they immediately thought it looked odd, similar but distinctly different from Streptanthus insignis. And this is what our plant looks like. So Tom was actually, at the same time, there was a bunch of vegetation mapping occurring in the park. And as it happened, they had just discovered some populations not too far from park headquarters. And so he was able to bring them out to look at it. And they definitely, and seeing it in person, just even more confirmed for them that this was something different. So, for one thing, at that time, they thought it looked more like San Benito jewelflower, but the habitat was totally different. So it grows in this kind of much of it is found in this sort of granitic alluvium, whereas Streptanthus insignis is found mostly on serpentine. And at Pinnacles, it was found in kind of poorly consolidated granitic and mixed alluvium, mostly granitic, derived from Selenian block granitics. And then also sometimes on these kind of volcanic sort of scree talus slopes. So they were pretty sure they had something new, and they collected several specimens for potential description to investigate more. And the park started trying to map and document the species. So from 2000 to 2003, they found several new populations, which are indicated by these red stars on the park map. And they collected samples from these populations for the description of it as a new species. But then things kind of slowed down. After that initial flurry of energy and effort, it sort of the ball got dropped. Nothing really happened for the next 15 or so years. I think probably Roy, who took the samples for potential description, got busy with other projects. He actually described several Streptanthus species, of which this was just one that was in his queue. And so nothing much happened until I came to the park in 2017. To be fair, there was a little bit of effort from my botanist predecessors to kind of elucidate what was going on and follow up. And so there were some efforts, but just not much was happening. But I started at Pinnacles almost exactly 6 years ago in the very beginning of 2017, January 7th of 2017. And when I started there, I came from Point Reyes, which had a really active rare plant program. And one of my goals was to sort of reinvigorate the rare plant program at Pinnacles. The rare plants, there's not as many rare plants. Point Reyes, of course, has an active rare plant program because there's many rare plant species and many endemic plants. But at Pinnacles, we have a lot of development and other projects going on, and it's important just to understand, not just interesting, but also important as we're doing planning to understand the distribution of these species, of rare species. And so we renewed it, and as part of that, I also renewed efforts to map and describe the jewelflower. Roy Buck was initially interested, and we corresponded about starting the efforts to describe the species. However, not that long after these efforts were started, he unfortunately passed away. And so that left this species somewhat orphaned. So what is this species? With my interest in this species, I went and sought some funding and decided to see if we couldn't get it described anyhow. And so I was able to receive a small grant from the Western National Park Association. And I reached out to Dr. Eva Lucacho, and she was interested in working with me. And so we started this project. So we had these sort of two potential, proposed lineages that we were sort of starting from. We had the Calanthus lemony and / Calanthus coulteri, which is a very closely related Calanthus that sometimes lemony has been lumped into, or the Streptanthus insignis, which is part of the Streptanthus glandulosus complex and is not extremely distantly related, but not that closely related to the Calanthus. So we began by looking at what Streptanthus we had in the area. We actually have a bunch of different types of Streptanthus and Calanthus in the area. We've got Calanthus coulteri / lemony. In the park, we actually have Streptanthus glandulosus, the sort of parent of these sort of glandulosus lineage, things like Streptanthus insignis, as well as Streptanthus brewery, and even Streptanthus or Calanthus anceps. So we've got several different sort of members of this streptanthoid complex, like Calanthus coulteri and lemony, insignis, and glandulosus found actually in the park, the potential parent. So where does ours sit? So within that Streptanthus glandulosus complex, it's interesting that there have been a number of sort of very narrow little endemics that have evolved from it. So we have the Mount Diablo jewelflower, Streptanthus hispidus, which also has a little sterile sort of cluster at the top of flowers that never develop. The Mount Hamilton jewelflower, kind of in the same range, that also has that. And the San Benito jewelflower, just directly to the east of the Pinnacles jewelflower. These are those species. Streptanthus glandulosus right nearby, though in a different habitat. And so many potential parents. Here you can see, though, the leaves of our Streptanthus pinnacles in the middle here are really kind of more similar to the Streptanthus insignis. They have this sort of weird lobing that you don't find as much on the Calanthus. So in order to look at this, we started by growing it in kind of ideal conditions. Grew it out in nursery containers and at home, actually. And we grew it in sort of a common garden experiment with Streptanthus insignis. So you could, here on the left, we can see the smaller, I think it's the left for you guys too. The smaller plant is Streptanthus species nova pinnacles, the pinnacles one, and the other one is the San Benito jewelflower. The seeds were started at the same time, but the San Benito jewelflower is already much larger, more fully developed, and they look quite distinct. Here you can see the leaves of the San Benito jewelflower on the right, and the Pinnacles jewelflower on the left. Fairly similar, but the Pinnacles jewelflower leaves are not nearly as bristly. And then the shapes of the flower, of the calyx of the flower, is actually quite distinct between these species. The Pinnacles jewelflower has this very kind of narrow profile when you look at it, whereas the Streptanthus insignis has kind of an inflated, kind of urn-shaped calyx to it, or sepals along the edges of the petals there. Streptanthus glandulosus has an even more pronounced urn shape to it than Streptanthus insignis, whereas Calanthus lemony actually, like our species, has a more narrow profile. And another thing we noticed when we grew it in kind of a cultivation conditions is that the sterile cluster in the Pinnacles subspecies was much less pronounced than in Streptanthus insignis. And so we made sort of a chart up comparing Streptanthus, the sort of undescribed species from that we purport or we believe as an undescribed species from Pinnacles, to several of these other species. So like Streptanthus insignis, it has similar leaves, but its fruit was quite different. It was more like Streptanthus glandulosus. However, its flower characteristics were more similar to Calanthus lemony and Calanthus coulteri. And its habitat was more similar to the Calanthus species. Over this period, we also found several new populations, which are indicated by the blue triangles. So we've been able to find 5 new populations, including ones that occurred in a little bit different habitat than we'd seen it before. But this still left us with a number of questions. And so we undertook genetic analysis to kind of get because even with all these traits, you can see with all these traits shared across all of these, that it was hard to distinctly say which of the two genera it fell in. And so that brought us to genetic analysis. And so Evelyn and I postulated it would probably end up being most closely related to the bristly jewelflower. It shared a lot of, when it was young, its leaf characteristics really closely resembled Streptanthus glandulosus and some of these other related Streptanthus. And so that is where we were and where I was the last time I gave this talk, just last month. But hot off the presses, we finally have gotten our genetic analysis completed. And so just as of a few days ago, I finally got the genetic results from this. And our little species is definitely very distinct. It comes off in its whole own little branch, all the different samples that we collected. But it's a Calanthus. It's definitely very much nested in that Calanthus clade, with Calanthus lemony and Calanthus inflatus being its closest relatives, and Calanthus coulteri. And so I was totally wrong about where I thought it was going to come in terms of its lineage. It's sort of like thinking maybe, yeah. So we are really excited that we finally got our genetic results back, and they do support that this is a new species, as well as our morphological studies. But our next steps are to complete the publication, which is in draft form right now, and then conduct more intensive habitat surveys and characterization, which we have a grant from the National Park Service to do right now, and get it printed up and officially recognized. And so, that is that species, which been working on for the last 5 years now, and we're finally getting to the point of publishing. 20 years after it was first identified as, more than 20 years after it was first identified as a new species, and 40 years after it was first collected. But we have some other rare plants in the park and other rare plant mysteries too. Another one of those little mysteries has been around the Nemocladus in the park. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about this species as well, the Robbins Nemocladus. This is a very rare species. This is CRPR 1B.2. So one of the rarer designations of the Native Plant Society, except for, of course, extinct ones, which are rare. And this is a very tiny little plant that is very easily overlooked and challenging to ID, partially because when you press it, it loses its petals. And so you can't, it's hard to use the pressed specimens for identification. But herbarium records are still valuable and they can still be really helpful. So this little species here, this is just sort of gives you a sense. It occurs in dry areas and washes in open chaparral and openings in chaparral. And this picture here is one I took, and this gives you an idea. There's my Nikon lens of how hard it can be to see this little guy. And it's quite, it's a quite small little plant that's very beautiful when you look close. And so this is another species that was identified first via, or came to my attention because of herbarium records. So right at the mouth of Pinnacles, we had these strange herbarium records of Nemocladus secundiflorus ferradura. This is a species that was not on our plant list, but is a very rare species. In addition, I found some pictures from a former park employee showing this species that had been identified by the expert on Nemocladus, who is Nancy Marin. So this started a search to identify, did we have it and how much do we have? We were able to quickly establish that we definitely had that species. I collected specimens and pictures and sent them to Nancy Marin. She confirmed it, and she in fact was one of the early people that had come and found it there. And so we started searching for it and documenting it in the park. In April 2022, we had a whole group of folks here looking for Nemocladus, and this is them working, but we'd actually started the efforts back in 2017. So we have been able to find it growing in almost everywhere we've looked for it, not in every individual spot, but in every drainage. It turns out to be really, really common in the park, which surprised me because it had never been reported. But it turns out that this species that we did have listed, Nemocladus gracilis, used to be a species name used for many, many small Nemocladus that has turned out over time to actually be different species. So it's kind of a catch-all. And so the question now is, do we even have Nemocladus gracilis in the park at all? In fact, our Nemocladus gracilis may be misidentifications of this other species. But going through CalFlora pictures, looking at pictures for pinnacles, searching on the term pinnacles, I came across this set of pictures by that same park employee, botanist Keir Morse, who had taken these pictures. And they were identified as Nemocladus ramosissimus, another species not on our plant list. And so I got to wondering, what's this little Nemocladus? Well, why are there pictures supposedly from pinnacles? And so I contacted Keir and I said, Keir, did you misidentify the location of these pictures? Because we don't have this on our plant list. And I knew he would have added it if he knew that occurred here. And he told me that he'd found that and taken pictures of it and identified it as Nemocladus gracilis. And then Nancy Marin had contacted him and told him that they were actually ramosissimus. And so from that, we realized that we actually had potentially another Nemocladus species in the park. And so this spring, that same group also went out and searched for this species, which also occurs in dry areas, particularly openings in chaparral. And we were able to find it. We were able to find verified observations of it in 2 locations. So that was really exciting. So now we have two of these. So now, like the Pinnacles Jewelflowers, these were found through a combination of both exploration, but also those really important kind of records that we keep of where we explore, particularly through herbariums. So the take-home message for all of these species is that, particularly for the jewelflowers, is that both genetic and morphological studies support that Pinnacles is a jewelflower distinct from other jewelflowers. It's a new species. And also that all of these species sort of highlight the importance of herbaria as repositories for diversity. The herbarium led to the potential discovery of the potential species at Pinnacles, and it's to this day continuing to elucidate other species. for this reason, where I've been really glad we're working to get our Pinnacles herbarium joined to the statewide database, because so that it's searchable, all its records are more easily searchable. They actually are online right now, but they're very challenging for people to search. And so that we can, our image scans, which we actually already have, are visible for the public, because it's likely there are more things like this out there. And of course, exploration is key. These herbarium and picture records were had to be verified by or were first discovered via exploration, even if they didn't know what they were at the time, and then were only verifiable through more exploration. So, and then I thought I would just highlight a couple of the other species that we're continuing to work on. Include the Pinnacles buckwheat, a species that is a very rare regional endemic, though it is found outside of Pinnacles. And it's a really cute little guy, actually. And we're discovering that it's growing in a lot more habitats than was previously known. The Hospital Canyon larkspur is another one that we're working on. It turns out to be quite underdocumented in general, but at Pinnacles, it turns out to be quite common. And this is just a part of the many programs that we have at Pinnacles in the botany program. So we also do have an invasive weeds program. We're in the middle of an Valley Oak study, prairie restoration, fungal inventory, and a partnership with some of the local tribes to look at doing traditional land management. And that's it. And so with that, I'll take any questions.
Appreciate if you would put questions in the electronically. Okay. Satya, your hand is up. You can unmute and ask your question.
Let's see. I don't think, is anyone, I don't think it's from.
Satya Levine had her hand up, it looked like.
Dave, are you speaking? I can't hear you. Oh, wait, let me just try and.
No, sorry, that was the clapping reaction. I was just expressing.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay, I couldn't hear anyone. My mute was activated again, so.
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, while people are formulating questions, I had one about the, you showed a genetic diagram with the Streptanthus and the Calanthus all mixed up. Does this mean that we should expect a kind of a renaming festival sometime in the future?
Yes. Sorry. Though I will say that the genetic genetic research that I highlighted that showed it was paraphyletic, that came out in 2014. So we've had those who've been paying attention have had 9 years now to start letting ourselves get comfortable with the idea. I mean, one thing, I did some investigation, and I will not be doing that work, like I'm just working on the Pinnacles Jewelflower, but I did do some investigation. I found that the first thing named Streptanthus was like a weirdo one, or to me weird, that's in like Alabama and the American South. And so it's possible that our California ones will lose the Streptanthus moniker, or else they'll have to make everything a Streptanthus. So, including Stanleya's. But actually, I think Stanleya's were named before Streptanthus. So everything would become Stanleya or something like that, or Thelopodium. So actually, I think Streptanthus or Stanleya might be the oldest name. So, because there's all the rules for botanical naming. So yeah. But what I think will be proposed is a bunch of names. There were a bunch of names that Green gave to what we now call Streptanthus. And so I suspect that we might end up going back to some names proposed by Green around the turn of the 1800s.
Does that mean that some of our local Marin Jewelflowers could get changed as well?
Yeah, it does, but it would probably just be they would still be their own distinct species, but their generic name might change from Streptanthus. So it might be something else.
Well, you know, Pinnacles is a place that for people that haven't been there, I suspect is a somewhat mysterious destination. And it might be useful just to describe when is a good time to come and what are good things to do. And
well, now is a good time to go, and now through April, even into May. But once it starts getting warmer, you have to go to Pinnacles really prepared to deal with the heat. There are some shady walks and hikes, but you definitely in the summer, you need to plan for around the heat. So you either go early, you plan for a shady walk, because the lower section, sometimes when people try and look up the temperature, they look up Piscinus, which is the town it's technically in, but which is much cooler than the park itself. And the lower sections of the park tend to be much cooler than the upper sections. So in the summer, it's not at all uncommon for it to be 110 and 115 on the upper exposed portions of the parks. And you have a lot of heat reflected by rocks. So we have a lot of issues with heat. It can be really beautiful actually in the summer. So if you plan well and are an experienced hiker and experienced with dealing with heat, it can still be worthwhile going. But it's really, for most people, winter and spring are really lovely times and the temperature is more conducive for longer hiking. So I definitely think it's a beautiful park, but it is one where planning around heat and bringing water is really important. This is a good time of year. This is a lovely time of year to look at the tree, fern, and moss species in the park and the lichens. And it's also a great time of year if you're interested in mushrooms to come to the park. This last year, we started doing our fungal inventory, something we'd never done before. We're finding a lot of diversity, more diversity than I thought of different species. And we've also been doing some genetic analysis of our mushroom species. But and then the spring is March and April through and May are wonderful times to see flowers. There's actually flowers that bloom all the way into October and November, and but for those later summer flowers, you have to weigh the heat with the flowers. So the peak bloom is April and May.
Okay, great.
But in April, spring break, it's very busy in the park, and spring break is also extremely busy time. If you're coming to Pinnacles in the spring, come on a weekday if you can. Come not during the biggest spring break weeks if you can. And also if you are coming on a weekend or something, try and get there early. Generally, things fill up by 9 a.m.
So I take it parking can be an issue.
Parking's a huge issue, especially in the upper areas. There are shuttles that will take you up there from the lower parking lot on busy weekends and weeks, busy periods. But parking can be an issue. But if you get there early in the morning, then you're usually fine.
Well, what a lovely presentation. It's to see that there are still things to be discovered out there, often in front of our eyes, that we're not seeing. So,
languishing unnoticed in herbarium for a long time, but that's the value of these records that can wait around to be noticed.
okay. Well,
they're also genetic snapshots, which is another thing that herbariums have been proven to be is sort of like really neat genetic snapshots of not only what species were around, but actually sometimes you see genotype or shifts over time, and that's captured sometimes in herbaria and other natural history collections.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And I want to return to our annual meeting for those that came in a little later than than our first annual meeting, I want to kind of end with an opportunity for folks who haven't had a chance to weigh in on the slate to do that. And I'm going to share my screen again. And then I'm going to bring up another poll. So anybody who hasn't voted, find the other poll. Here it is. Anybody that hasn't voted and is a member of the Marin chapter, I'd appreciate if you would fill in this poll so that we will have a complete count and can meet our quorum requirements. So I'll give a few minutes to any latecomers who have not voted already, who are Marin members, to fill out the poll. And while we're doing that, let me introduce what we're going to be featuring next month on the second Monday. It's going to be by Mian Monroe, who I'm sure is known to most of you from her work at Muir Woods and now with monarch butterflies. She's going to talk about monarchs make Marin their home again. And she's going to talk about the steep decline and perhaps some guarded optimism about what monarchs are doing in the county. And she'll be joined by Ole Schell and Audrey Fusco in that talk. So that should be fascinating. The second Monday in January, and we hope to see you then. We also hope that you have a good and safe holiday. And we look forward to seeing you next month and in the months to come. So thanks again. I'm going to end the poll at this point and stop sharing. And hope to see you next month. Good night.